In colonizing Egypt, I wrote about the city out of an interest in questions of representation. And I think understanding modern forms of representation in a particular way in their relationship to colonialism was the central theme of that book. I wanted to show the limitations of a certain way of thinking about representation as a universal way of producing meaning, and show that the way in which we think about meaning, we think about the construction of orders of meaning is actually something that's come into being quite recently over the last couple of 100 years and is tied in a very specific way to the history of colonialism. And for me, the city was a very good way of exploring that. And it was a way of exploring the question of representation, of orders of representation, or orders of meaning materially as they are built. So that one could do a kind of conceptual thinking, but do it in terms of very concrete forms of collective life, as exemplified by the ordering of urban space. Whether that's still central to my thinking, I think not in the same way. Not because I don't think those questions are still absolutely of great importance, but I'm not myself currently directly concerned with questions around representation as I was thinking about it then. I found it useful to use the term capitalization rather than the term capitalism to think about a central aspect of modern collective life and modern forms of political economy. I'm not the only one who's turned to the word. Nitzan and Bichler's most recent book has been enormously helpful, though I think I take the term capitalization in a slightly different direction. Again, I think perhaps a more material direction, more concerned with the materiality, the built. Let me say a word first about capitalization before relating it to the city. So the idea of capitalization points to a particular way of rendering the future available in the present. It refers to a way of building durable structures of accumulation where a certain amount of the income or the profit that can be expected in the future can be sold to people in the present. And it's a basic term in finance, but it has a very interesting and a very material history. It is the process that is at the heart, on the one hand, of the joint stock company, the modern business firm, publicly traded business firm, but also at the heart of the modern urban form as well. Both those articulating differently in different parts of the world, whether between Europe and North America or in parts of the colonial world, post-colonial world. Let me say what I mean by it being at the heart of these financial processes and give a concrete example. The way it begins in terms of the modern joint stock company is not usually tied to real estate. It could be. It's usually thought of in relation to the railroad company. Railroads, of course, came out of the great energy transformations of the 19th century, the arrival of coal, of steam power, of iron and steel, which were related to those, and the ability out of those to build a new kind of very durable structure. The railroad, the large scale, the often transcontinental railroad. And these were significant structures, not only in their scale, and the complexity of their management, which are the reasons usually given for the rise of the joint stock company in association with the railroad, but because of their durability in time. So they have a spatial extent, but also a temporal extent. You were building a structure that could promise a revenue, not just for a year or 5 years, but for 10 years or 50 years. And what you could do was then take the durability of that revenue and sell shares in it in the present. That's what a joint stock company is. one can think of that then as a way, as a very particular technology or mechanism for moving future earnings, future, future forms of surplus, and selling them to people in the present. And if you like, then as a certain charge or tax upon on the future, and directly then upon working populations of the future, those who will be working, running those structures of accumulation, but also paying for goods, paying for services that are moved around through that transportation system. The cost of all those things in the future will bear this tax, this burden of paying for the speculation that it's been possible to construct in the present by selling shares through a stock market on that future life. And the railroad exemplifies that, and indeed was the major form of this in the 19th century. It then expanded to many other forms, and ultimately to manufacturing and all other kinds of large-scale, durable, relatively long-term productive life. This was a complete transformation in forms of accumulation, one that Marx just begins to grasp the significance of in Volume 3 of Capital. He refers to it using a notion of fictitious capital because of the notion that the accumulation that people are trading in and speculating in the joint stock company hasn't happened yet. But I think that term fictitious is unusual because it sort of contrasts a sort of real economy, a real accumulation in the present, with something that is artificial, that is unreal. The only difference is in the temporality and the ability to control politically that future. And that political control is a point that Nitzan and Bichler insist upon. You've got to be able to not just, in technical terms, construct a durable system of revenue through iron and steel and steam power and all the other technical breakthroughs that make that possible. But you've got to also politically control the route of that railroad, or at least be able to promise to investors that you can. So I don't think that's actually very fictitious, or the word fictitious doesn't capture actually a very specific set of both spatial and temporal technologies that come into being with modern forms of energy and control over space and time. So it doesn't only happen with railroads. There are many other large infrastructural projects, and if one thinks of places like Egypt, the building of the Suez Canal, the first Aswan Dam, many other large-scale projects offer the same ability to build durable structures that promise decades of revenue and then sell shares in that future. And realize income in the present that is going to be a tax on the productive life of future populations. But then the other vast world in which this happens is in real estate, which operates in the same kind of way, that if you can put up a building, let's say a residential building, that appears to guarantee a level of income over the next decades, or the next 50 years, or whatever, you can then realize that income in the present, because the price of buying, let's say, an apartment in that apartment building will be not what it costs to build, it will be the value of 50 years of being able to live in that space. And so the speculator, the investor, can actually sell that future income in the present as the price, as what appears the cost of that building, as I say, not related directly to the material costs of building, but a product of that ability to control futures. Again, it's a political control. It's a control that depends on planning, on zoning in its various forms, on maintaining the livability of forms of neighborhood and so on, so that value of being able to live in that neighborhood does indeed appear to stretch forward over decades and so on. And one gets to the situation where real estate becomes such a powerful way of doing this that in most parts of the world it comes to account for at least 50% of this ability to turn future revenue into present forms of speculative income. To me, what's interesting about thinking in terms of capitalization is that one actually sort of downplays the notion that this is speculative, is fictive, is somehow based on things that are unreal, that are not solid in the way that, for example, manufacturing or other forms of income are thought of. It is, but what is being manufactured is different. You're not manufacturing short-term physical goods. You're manufacturing this long-term spatial future. And that's, I think, the usefulness of the term capitalization for thinking about the built environment in a new kind of way. You ask how that differs from sort of post-Fordist notions of thinking about the specificity of cities today. I think it's slightly different, and it offers a different way than one finds, for example, in the work of David Harvey and others. It's hard to do justice to the work of David Harvey in a brief discussion like this, but I think the key difference is that in the work that thinks in post-Fordist terms, first of all, there's a sort of a marked distinction between an age of sort of manufacturing and manufacturing production and a more speculative age in which we live. I think that disjuncture, that break can be overemphasized, because I think what had happened in that earlier phase of capitalism, it was still organized in important ways around this same principle of the building of durable futures. And the other point of difference, or difference of emphasis, would be that a lot of work on the city, including the Arab city, thinks in terms of problems of overaccumulation. That there are forms of wealth being generated that then look for outlets in which to invest that surplus. And forms of spatial expansion, urban expansion, are somehow seen as soaking up a capital that exists and has got nowhere to go. I think thinking in terms of capitalization rather reverses that optic, because capital and surplus aren't the problem. What matters, or the opportunity available, is the ability to construct spatially these forms of future revenue, and the capital is actually a capital that is going to exist in the future, that is moved into the present. It's not a capital in the present that exists as a vast surplus needing somewhere to go. So when a speculator decides to erect a very expensive building, he doesn't run around looking for people who have got millions and millions of dollars bulging in their pockets. What he does is he or she sets out a future revenue structure, and then in collaboration with the banks, who of course are always closely involved in these kinds of things, opens up a line of credit. And that's it. You don't actually have to sort of go to people's pockets to get the money for this, because that line of credit exists into the future as the future revenue that you are capitalizing by the kinds of durable structures that you can build. So you're not soaking up capital, you're actually expanding credit. So I think the whole notion of crises of overaccumulation that drives a lot of the analysis of the way in which urban expansion, sort of speculative urban expansion, happens, misses the financial and material dynamic of the construction of cities that one can get at through a notion of capitalization. This is a different way of thinking about the city than ways that frame it in terms of a problem of rent and rentierism. And let me explain that difference. The problem with theories of rent, the rentier state, is that they tend to oppose that way of thinking about the economic to a sort of normal situation of the market. On the one hand, there is markets and there are profits from markets, and on the other, there is this aberrant system that is based on rent, that is based on some monopoly or exclusive control of a resource. Exemplified whether by oil or by real estate and other things that are central to modern Arab economies. I don't think that's helpful because I think those forms of monopoly are found everywhere in one form or another. And I think it gives much too much centrality and normality to the idea of the market as a sort of organizing principle of modern capitalism. I think it's much more helpful to think about processes like capitalization as having been central to the organization of forms of modern life, and to get away from a simple notion of monopoly as being what distinguishes some form of economic life from another. Capitalization is absolutely dependent on a form of monopoly, or at least on forms of political control over, and not just market control, over the asset, the arrangement, the technical world that has that durability through time in the future that you want to sell shares in the present. And the more you can guarantee that future structure of revenue and accumulation, the more you can profit in the present from that future. So that's an aspect of all of very large areas of collective economic life over the last 100 years or more. And I don't think thinking of some economies as rentier economies as somehow being different is particularly helpful. On the specific question of the way in which real estate operates in cities of the Gulf and elsewhere in the Arab world, I think actually David Sims's work has been enormously important. It's from him that I've learned this particular point about a relationship between the urban and its kind of ecological setting that is not unique to cities of the Arab world, but is found there perhaps more frequently. And that is an arrangement where very large cities are built in circumstances where the hinterland around them into which they want to expand tends not to be privately owned, but claimed by the state or by various agencies of the state, whether the armed forces or so on. The margin of urban expansion is a vital one in where a city is developing at the edge, whether it's onto undeveloped land or redeveloping existing land, is of course that critical sort of frontier of capitalization. That's where the opportunities are arising to expand and to construct these new long-term revenue structures. And so it matters how that sort of frontier is structured and operates. And one of the features of many cities of the Arab world is that frontier is a desert, therefore is not usually subject to direct private ownership. There may be forms of collective or tribal claim over it, but as often as not, it's the state that has come to claim it. And therefore, the state is playing a role in the process of capitalization that is much more explicit and is much more direct than the way in which it's played that role before. So I think simply saying that there's a problem of rentierism in Arab states and in Arab real estate is not helpful. It doesn't get at the ecological development dimension of that. It doesn't get at the way that situates the state differently in relation to the possibilities of making available new tracts for that kind of process of real estate capitalization. And it misses the opportunity to look at the dynamic between that form of role that the state can have and its role in the energy sector, in its control of oil, which of course is again not unique to Arab states, but a distinctive feature that the state has that second source of revenue concentrated in its hands with its enclave nature and so on, and looking at that that relationship between two structures of accumulation, one in real estate and one in oil, is enormously important. Limitation of so much of the rentier state literature when it emerged around oil revenues, as I wrote in Carbon Democracy, is it didn't think about the material nature of the oil. It just immediately jumped to the question that there seemed to be all this cash generated. It was thinking about the money and not the oil. And so one of the things that's missed is the relationship between oil and the real estate. Why is it that the two developed in this particular relationship to each other in contemporary Arab states is different to the way in which real estate worked with other forms of productive life elsewhere in the world? That's an interesting question to think together, the question of materiality and the issue of thinking from the South. And I'm not sure I've done that explicitly, but I'll try and think it through. One of the things one is trying to do in thinking from the South, as so much of post-colonial theory has shown, is undermine, destabilize, provincialize the sort of sovereignty of certain forms of Western thought, which is, of course, the sovereignty of theory. It's the sovereignty of a set of concepts, a set of key ideas, a concept of democracy, a concept of modernity, a concept of reason, many of these key terms of modern political thought that are taken as a template and then applied to areas outside the West, so that non-Western history and politics has to be thought against that template. So thinking from the South is not just thinking against the sort of sovereignty of a Western model, but it's also thinking against the very idea of a model, thinking against the concept, thinking against the universal in a certain sense, that there is such a thing as an idea, a model, a concept that arises somewhere and then gets applied to many other places in the world. I think that's the connection to materiality, because materiality is another way of thinking against the concept. It's saying, for example, I'm not going to write a history of democracy, or I'm not going to take the concept of democracy and apply it to some other part of the world. I'm going to ask a set of quite material questions about the ability of populations to interrupt authority or impose a certain accountability on those who govern them. I'm interested in that ability and the instances of that in very material ways, in ways that are not about the spread of an idea of democracy in people's heads or culture of accountability, but are looking in very practical terms at the way in which certain forms of movement, arrangement, structures of ways things are accumulated, populations are governed, are open to interruption, are open to challenge, and so on. So one can think of materiality itself, think of ways of attending to technical, practical, material aspects of collective life as a particular way of thinking about large questions that doesn't begin from the concept, and therefore, in that sense, is working against a certain kind of Eurocentrism because of the way in which Eurocentrism is associated with the concept, with taking a certain idea and then looking for its expression elsewhere. So in my mind, I think one can relate a certain kind of post-colonial theory, a certain attempt to provincialize Europe and European experience as being directly advanced by an attention to the material. One's got to be careful how one does that, because of course there's another way where one does it where the West is the site of theory and the non-West is merely the site of the practical and the material. And that's not the implication at all, because one wants to do exactly the same thing when one turns to think about any of those concepts in the context of studying the West, whether it's of democracy or any other key idea. One will want to make the same move, but I think there is a relationship between an avoidance of this thing called theory and a turn towards the material and the technical, relationship between that and forms of deprovincializing European experience. I think there are several ways in which turns to the material and the technical have allowed us to open up new ways of studying colonialism, or if they're not new, at least to change the emphasis. One of the ways I've done it in my own work is through being more attentive to questions of nature, of disease, of the non-human in its various forms, the mosquito, the malaria, and so on. Of course, as I say, that's an example of something that's not new. There's a long, long tradition of environmental history, ecological history, histories of disease, and so on that has done this work, including people studying them in the Middle East. I suppose to some extent, some of that work has tended to be bracketed as a kind of niche field and not integrated so centrally into the main studies of colonial history. And so one of the things one wants to try and do is to think how one then rewrites works of political economy, works of political history, dealing with the colonial world, in which the ecological, the non-human, the material is not treated as some separate field of specialization, but is used to actually redefine what we mean by political economy, what we mean by the political, what we mean by political actors. And I think that's one way in which I've tried to think about possibilities for writing about colonial politics, colonial history, learning from those who've worked in the past on forms of environmental, ecological history and so on, but bringing them into conversation with forms of political and social history. How that relates to the specifics of settler colonialism and themes of dispossession, I think I could try and approach that only in terms of specific examples of what one might do differently. I mean, I think there's so much scope to do this. For example, in the history of Palestine, that's already been done. Well, let me take one simple example. I mean, one of the most influential books dealing with settler colonialism in Palestine in the late 19th, early 20th century is Gershon Shafir's Land Labor, The Origins of the Israel-Palestine Conflict. Great book, but looking at the dynamics of the relationship between the settler population and the Palestinian population, and developing a whole argument about the history of Zionism from that a very specific dynamic of, how do you survive on the land? How do you make it work? And the inability, as Shafir argues, of the Jewish settler population to subsist in the way of the Palestinian population. But in fact, in the book, there's very, very little about farming and how farming works, and about what enables a population to subsist and not subsist. And there's a kind of assumption in the argument that the dynamic that unfolds is due to the European population expecting a higher standard of living than the Palestinian population. And therefore they can't afford to live off the very low wages that Palestinians can live off. Structures the whole argument of the book and a lot of debate that has followed since. I don't know the evidence for that. Might it not be simply that the Palestinians were better farmers? Might it not be that they had a certain relationship to the land and to the possibilities of the land, of certain crops, a knowledge of what could be planted when and where, that simply meant that Palestinians could live actually at a better standard of living than the settler population. Now, I don't know, and I don't know enough about more detailed histories of that period, but I think that absence of what I would call the material dimension in what is would normally be taken as a very sort of materialist analysis of the whole history of Zionism, that one learns nothing about the actual dynamics of farming, of different kinds of seeds or plants, of citrus cultivation and its problems. That entire world is missing from what we would think of as a material analysis. And that kind of level, I think one would open up a whole set of additional questions, and one would include not only the citrus and the olives and the wheat and everything else, but also, of course, the mosquitoes, the malaria, and there's been studies of that, the vines, the parasites affecting the wine that have chased the Rothschilds out of Europe and moved them to Palestine, and that then catch up with them a generation later in Palestine. There's so much to be told about that history that is either missing, or where there have been good studies, they've been rather separate kind of specialized studies of those kinds of issues. So the question of the archive and how one deals with representational materials, historical documents, in ways that are not too representational, if you like. And this takes us back to what I was talking about at the beginning, that initially my interest in the city was around questions of representation in a way that is not quite the same focus anymore. And I'd say the same about the archive. And this is where I think the work of Latour has been, Bruno Latour has been very helpful to me. It's not a question of not being interested in representation and modes in which the past is represented and can be recuperated from archives and other forms of representation. It's not, in the case of the city, of being uninterested in the visual forms, the representational forms, the question of architecture itself, for example. But it's a question of how one situates the representational in relation to all the other aspects of our complex forms of social existence. And in particular, to not approach the representational, as it were, as one half of life. One of the problems with that I was trying to get at even in the very beginning, colonizing Egypt, with the way we think about representation, is that we divide the world, as it were, into two, into reality and its representation, into these two orders of being. And the answer is that is not to say that representation doesn't matter, but to think that that's just one particular a form of separation, and that representational practice, concern with with aspects of meaning, of how things take on significance, is not 50% of what matters. It's not the meaningful life, the meaningful dimension of things in relation to the material, the real. Rather, that representation is just one of many things that goes on, and one way to do that is to refer to the many different kinds of practice that all get lumped together into something that it gets called representation. So, for example, archiving is a practice. It's a practice of government. It's a practice of administration. It's a form of memory, and so on. And it can be compared and talked alongside other forms, other kinds of practice. Architecture might be one, writing might be another. Multiple forms of reference, of storage, of inscription, of illustration, all these things that we sort of, in many conventional forms of analysis, we sort of lump together as being all in their different ways concerned with this fundamental question of meaning, of what do things mean, of representation, of how we construct an order of meaning in reference to the real world. And we slip back into this binary, bifurcated world of meaning versus reality, of representation versus the real. Now, the answer to that is not to say, well, everything's all mixed up and there's no difference between everything. No, there's lots of differences. And there's a difference between archiving and the building facades of buildings and forms of literature and many other forms of use of writing, of inscription, of reference, of memory, of recall, and so on, that are among the practices that organize our collective life, and in many of which the ability to recall, the ability to store, the ability to reference is a part. And that's different from either saying everything's all the same and there's no such thing as meaning versus reality. It's different from that. It's also different from saying the world is just divided into meaning or culture on the one hand and reality and the material on the other. So it's a difficult path to explain and to get at, but one's trying to constantly do that. And it's something that I have learned, I think, among others from Latour. And another way to frame the same thing, when Latour in his early work wrote about laboratory science, he described it as studying science in action, and trying, as opposed to work in the philosophy of science, trying to get at what science was by just understanding what scientists do. And one way he expressed that is saying, there's nothing scientific about science. There's no sort of secret scientificity to the form of production of truth or knowledge that defines science as science. If you want to understand what scientists do, just follow scientists in the lab and look at their forms of practice, the way they write things down, the way they construct machines and devices to bring nature under control so they can, the way they move between the field and the laboratory. There's a whole set of practices that produce this thing called science, but you won't find any sciencey essence to it. And I'd say the same for any other form of life, whether the archival or the architectural or the planning. No one's not going to find some sort of essence of the city or some essence of the historical that is somehow summed up by the archival, summed up by architectural practice and planning. One's going to find a certain coming together of a whole set of different techniques, and by following those techniques of planning, of inscribing, of building, of constructing, one's going to get at what's specific to those in a particular time and place. And if one thinks that one's going to make sense of it by talking about the material here and meaning there, these binary, bifurcated worlds that is given to us by the language of social science, by terms like culture, I unfortunately the term material itself as the opposite of what is cultural or meaningful. That seems to me the way to go. Yeah, I suppose it's a particular problem for those doing historical forms of research, that you seem particularly dependent upon the documentary on the past as captured through representations of the past, and therefore you're stuck in a world that seems to be constructed as a system of meaning. But I don't think we have to take that route, even though the sources we're dealing with lead us down a sort of path of concern with meaning, the meaning of the past, and so on. And again, Latour himself, I think, manages to avoid that, and he has written stuff that is historical. The main example would be the work, The Pasteurization of France, which is written entirely from historical sources. But I would also say in almost all the other work he's done, where there's been a specific case through which he's explored things, that he has avoided slipping into those dualisms. His essay on circulating reference in Pandora's Hope, I think, is a wonderful example of how do you deal with documents, with references. And it's actually an essay about a group of scientists, of biologists and others, who are concerned with plants and the rainforests and things, but also with maps and with taxonomies and all sorts of forms of reference. And how does one get at that world without assuming that is a world that it consists of reality on the one hand and reference on the other? And his notion of circulating reference is precisely a way to do that. And I'd say, as historians, one can think in the in similar kinds of ways, because if the archive doesn't exist as a representation of the past, it wasn't put together in order to produce a representation of the past. It's a particular set of resources that includes among it, includes in it a lot of work of inscription, let's say of writing, of reference to other inscriptions, to other works of writings, because archives are organized referentially from one file referring to the next, but also in terms of inscriptions and references that are references to non-written forms, to individuals, to what was said, to what was done, and so on. So I think as one pays attention to work, the work that is done to reference, to inscribe, to store, to recall, and thinks of these as forms of social practice, one gets away from a simple assumption that the archive is no more than a representation of the past, which of course no historian, no self-respecting historian would say, but I think it can be theorized perhaps a little bit more along these kinds of lines. I think the focus on the square, on public space, and through that on the city, on the urban, in thinking about the Arab uprisings, was enormously useful for getting us away from older ways of thinking about problems of democracy in the Arab world, where the public space that everybody thought about was inside people's heads. The problem of democracy was somehow thought to be that people didn't want it, or weren't conscious of it, or hadn't figured out how to want it enough, or all those kinds of things that governed mainstream debates about democracy in the Arab world for so long, and resurfaced with the invasion of Iraq and so on, that circled around questions of enlightenment, of culture, of cultural obstacles, and so on. And so with the uprisings in 2011, and with that very dramatic seizure of public space, one shifted. Suddenly, there was no problem anymore of consciousness. Everybody wanted these forms of political freedom that they'd somehow seemed not to want before. And it was about this much more practical business of seizing space, occupying space, using the occupation of space to present demands to weaken regimes and so on. So that was very positive. But I think there's a danger in extrapolating a particular way from that, which is to say that democracy is always going to be about the square, about public space, about a certain configuration of the urban and the ability to seize physical control of that space. I think that would be the wrong move to make. I think what would be more useful would be to understand why at that moment did it become possible to seize public spaces. I mean, it wasn't as if people hadn't tried that before. There was a long history of forms of control or attempted seizure of control of demonstrations in public spaces in Beirut, in Tehran, in Cairo itself. I mean, those lines of trucks with troops sitting on them, always just sort of behind the back of Midan Tahrir and other centers of public space, were not there just for the fun of it, because there had been earlier attempts over decades to seize these sites of public space. And of course, in Palestine, with the first and second intifadas and their own prehistories and so on. So, nevertheless, distinctive things happened in 2011 that made it possible to seize public space and for a number of months make those sites the center of a place where people were forced to be answerable. If regimes did not answer, then public space was going to be the way that refusal to answer was going to be made manifest. But of course, it's gone again. I think to understand that isn't to sort of focus on the square, public space, occupation as the essential form of politics, but to ask what made it possible and why has it gone away again, and what other ways of interrupting the regular exercise of power might be possible that used some of the same possibilities, but were not necessarily focused on the occupation of public space, seeing that the regimes have now realized that they can't let that happen again, and have put in place forms of control to try and make sure that doesn't happen again. So I think that's how one's, I think it would be useful. And of course, those planning those occupations thought long and hard about how to overcome earlier defenses to such moments of occupation. But so one might want to think about that again, but also about what other kinds of challenge were possible. And of course, in the case of Egypt, we know that, for example, there were other contestations around police brutality, police power, that led up to the moment of January the 25th, around the death of Khalid Said in Alexandria, occupations of factories, workplace sit-ins, strikes, and so on. So there were many other aspects of challenges to political power that were important of paving the way to January the 25th, and one would think about again. You asked how this relates to my own thinking about democratic politics from calm democracy. To me, what I wanted to understand in calm democracy, the way that I came to understand democracy, democratic politics, was around the notion of vulnerability. That what is it at certain moments, briefly, makes ruling orders, dominant forms of accumulation, vulnerable to interruption, to challenge, to protest in ways they haven't been before. And I told a whole story of the emergence of modern mass democracy around a very specific point of vulnerability between about 1895 and 1915, basically, the history of the general strike, dock workers, coal workers, and so on. That opportunity came and went for quite specific reasons, as I tried to articulate. And I think, again, it wasn't an argument to say the only way you'll ever have democracy is if you can organize a general strike based on coal workers, dock workers, and rail workers. That's not the point. The point is histories of vulnerability, or points of vulnerability, and trying to identify where those points of vulnerability are. I think there's been a lot of very interesting work recently thinking about these questions of informality, forms of accumulation that exist outside the organized structure of the economy, and so on. And you mentioned Vinay Gidwani's work in India and many similar examples. And I think there's a lot more thinking to be done of that sort, and work that I myself haven't really done. I've written a little bit about rural Egypt, including both historically and in the present. I think it's interesting that the question of informal housing, of the communities who live in this broader thing called the informal economy, we think about it in relation to the urban and the city, where there's as many as 90% of the population are living in housing they built themselves and living lives that are not dependent on any kind of formal employment. It's an extraordinary situation, or if they have formal employment, that's not even their main source of income. One shouldn't forget that what happens in the cities is replicated and even extended in the countryside. The countryside is a world of ashbayat on a vast scale. People still build their own houses or build them with small-scale local entrepreneurs and live outside a world of formal employment and regular wage labor, or they have all those things mixed together with owning a little bit of land or farming a little bit of land and having some sort of government job that barely pays and making some money on the side on an occasional way. So what we think of as that informal economy of the city, actually, not just in Egypt, but in other parts of the Arab world and other parts of the South, characterizes far, far more than just the city. And I don't think we've thought through questions about politics and political consciousness and so on adequately in those terms. And, Subaltern Studies, the great sort of school of post-colonial South Asian studies, formed itself around this problem of how to account for peasant consciousness. It seems, something almost from the past, though there's another round of debate around it nowadays. Surprising how absent that is today from debates about the Arab world, actually. And I don't think we have the terms to do it, because the moment we start talking about an object called the peasant and another object called consciousness, I think we're already on the wrong track. But I do think some sense that we need to think about those two things together, the rural and the urban, and that we need to think about the ways in which people do this extraordinary job, whether in the countryside or in the vast informal areas of cities, of making a living, of sustaining themselves, of getting by to an extraordinary extent. That still seems to me one of the most remarkable aspects of the contemporary Arab world. Their populations are by and large not dependent on a formally structured economy or the state for making a living, for surviving, for housing themselves, for all those kinds of things. Egypt has built more planned cities than any other country in the world, and they house almost nobody. Everybody has just got on with it, and as David Sims has shown, and actually built the vast amount of housing themselves, no way connected to the state or to even a sort of formal economy of real estate construction and the financing that would go with that and so on. We have very little sense of that. Really at the kind of level I'm talking about. We've left a lot of the study of it to the anthropologists, which is fine. Somebody's doing it, which is great, but often with a different set of concerns away from these issues of the political and the political economy, with which we would want to think about these things. But I think there was this profound sense after the period in Egypt, 2011, 2013, the countryside. What did the revolution mean for the countryside? It was a revolutionary experience in the countryside, but how did that connect with what was going on in Tahrir, in the cities? We have a much better sense of the revolutionary life of Alexandria, of Port Said, and so on, and of course of Cairo, than of almost anywhere else, even though most people live in all those other places. So I don't think I've answered your question, but I do think it means that this issue of political vulnerability and the vulnerability of regimes is very differently posed in situations where such a large majority of the population is actually not particularly dependent for getting by on a formal economy in any sense.